The Women's Leadership Institute in the Auburn University College of Liberal Arts is pleased to present Leaders Educating Through Discussion. We hope you will take a moment after you watch our presentation to add your own voice to the dialogue on our website, auburn.edu/women's leadership.
All right. When Giovanna called me, she asked me to do kind of a memoir. I think a lunch speaker needs to both entertain and educate, and so that's my intention. This was really a form of reflection, and so if you haven't done it, I urge you to try it, because I learned a whole lot doing this, some of which I will share and some of which was pretty internal. There's clear themes when I look at my professional work and my life in general, and those themes are the themes of partnership and how important that is, the value of partnerships and the importance of reciprocity, and as we heard this morning, reciprocity has even moved to transformation. We want to go beyond reciprocity, and I think that's a really good message. Collaboration in many forms is the story of my life. I think of community, and have for a long time, as a co-educator, as a co-partner, and somebody this morning said as a co-producer of knowledge, and I'd like to extend mine to that too. That's a great kind of insight to have. And then, of course, last but not least, the importance of scholarship in the engagement work you do. And that was a real process for me, too, as I will share. So, who am I? I'm a first-generation college student. I realized that I was the first in my family. And the second point is one of the things that I think was most powerful in my development, and of which I'm quite proud. My grandmother, Helen, raised 13 children. And my grandfather left after the 13th was born, and that's probably a good thing in some ways. But it meant that she raised those children and provided for them, and I still don't know how she did it. But all through my young life, I was just blown away by her as a person and her energy and the kind of things she did. Then my parents raised me in a small town, and it truly was that notion of a whole village raising children, and I'm really glad I had that experience. And I grew up playing school. I was always a teacher. Now you can imagine, my grandmother had almost 70, I think it was just under 70 grandchildren. So I always had kids to play with, and they always let me be teachers because I was one of the oldest. So it was great practice. What did I observe as a young person? And I really dug back on this. And one of the things I observed is that my family was very committed to community in a way that was very traditional at that time. We were constantly doing things for people that had an illness or moved into a new place, or those times when you really need some help from outside. I can't say I see that very much anymore. What do you think? Do you see this tradition? It bothers me because I still do it, and my kids have grown up doing it, and my grandkids are growing up doing it. But we don't see it surrounding us as often as we'd like to, and I'm sorry that's gone away. All my relatives did volunteer work. I just grew up thinking that's what you do. That's how you live. And then this large extended family I had, thanks to my grandmother, was a real laboratory for learning about relationships and collaboration. Can you imagine 13 kids living in one home with one mom, and the kind of collaboration that had to happen just in order to exist? And the rest of us were always over there visiting. So we learned well how to deal with a lot of complex relationships in small spaces, because that's another element when you start talking about relationships. We learned a lot. So she taught me a lot. My educational preparation was, in my head, all about serving, so I did an undergraduate degree. And then, I don't ever tell public audiences this, so you're the first. My doctorate was in curriculum instruction with a specialization in early childhood education. Now, the reason I've kept that private is because most people look at early childhood education as less than or not really a disciplinary area, when in fact, all I learned about human development, about the importance of community, and all of those kind of things came from my background in early childhood education. So I decided to start telling people about it and letting people know what a strong influence that can have especially in all the work I've done with faculty over the years. We were doing project-based approaches with young children 30, 40 years ago. We're now doing it at universities. We were doing integrated learning. Integrated curriculum is the only way you teach young children. We're now doing it at universities. I could go on and give you a list, but it was a powerful preparation, and so you're the first to hear me go after that. I always had an influence on children, families, and community, because you can't work with children without paying attention to those contexts that surround them. And even through graduate school, I served on lots of community boards, et cetera, et cetera. Now I'll have to tell you a little part that's not in here. I was a single mom with 4 children. And I did a graduate program, and I served on all these boards, and I even had a Girl Scout troop. And I was the most popular Girl Scout leader because when we went on camping trips on the weekends, I usually fell asleep pretty quick. I was so exhausted, and the girls loved it because then they did the things they wanted to do. So I had quite a reputation, and I didn't realize for a while they always said, oh, please take us on the camping trip. We don't want the other leaders to go. Well, that was why. I was exhausted by Friday nights, but it served me well, I guess. Anyway, as I went into higher education, I had 2 big commitments. One was I was determined to be student-centered in my teaching, and by the way, that came from early childhood education. And then the other thing, to be honest with you, was a survival technique. Anyone here in teacher education? Oh, too bad. Oh, yay. Well, if you're going to work in teacher education, you're going to work in schools, and you're going to work in communities. And the hours you spend don't count for anything in terms of promotion and tenure. Now, I'd love to think it's changed, but I don't think it is. So I realized early on that I had to integrate my scholarship with the kind of work I was doing with schools, or I would never survive. There was just no way to separate those and do very different kind of scholarship. So from the very, very beginning, I figured that lesson out, that that's the only way I was going to survive, and I did. So my early professional experiences were all in teacher education. I'm going to tell you about each of these. One was called Classrooms as Communities. It was a very unique teacher ed program. You don't have to be in teacher ed anymore now to understand some of this. I always use school and community sites for my work. I also helped design and participated in a program called Classrooms as Families, and I'm going to tell you about that. I worked a lot under the leadership of Judith Rameli. Anybody know about her work in community engagement? She's a big leader in that, and was just an amazing leader. And then lastly, helped design a collaborative program called Child and Family Studies. So what I've done from here on is I'm going to talk about each of these, but talk about the lessons I learned rather than just about the programs, because that's what you're here for more than anything. Early on, I won something called the George Hoffman Award for my teaching, and I'm really proud of that because you don't often get rewarded for your teaching, and I happen to think if we're not doing that, we need to be doing something else with our lives. I also wrote a book on teaching strategies because I think we needed to be more specific and help students learn that better. So one of the kind of collaborative projects that I designed and worked on was called Classrooms as Families. And a little background on it, we had some school districts outside of Portland that were struggling with the kind of issues children bring to school that most teachers were not prepared to deal with. They were prepared to teach, but in some ways they ended up being social workers and psychologists, and counselors, and all kinds of things. And so 4 of these districts who were really struggling came to the university and said, could you help us prepare some teachers who could better serve the needs of our children? So we worked with counseling, we worked with special ed, and we worked with the teachers in that district for a year designing a new program. And we spent long nights with some pizza and whatever. And the classroom teachers were as involved and participatory in that process of designing the program as we were. We made a commitment to teach the whole program there in the school districts, and put those students in the district as much as possible. I'm happy to tell you that a couple of them are principals in that district. Many of them are still teaching in alternative kind of schools where they can really use the much more complex skills that they develop in the program. But what did I learn from that program that I can share with you? Well, one is that the importance of sharing your history and tradition builds more trusting relationships. So let me tell you my story. Long after we developed the program, the students had graduated, many of them were teaching in the district, and we'd have these breakfasts once every couple months with the teachers to say, how's it going, how'd it work? About a half a year into that, a couple of them said, you know, we've got to tell you something. And I said, yeah, okay, is there a problem? You know, you get ready for the problem. And they said, no, we never thought you'd really implement this program. We thought you were just, you know, making us feel good and getting us to go along with things, and then you'd do what you usually did. And I said, we spent all those nights together, you know, working on things, and you thought we weren't going to use it. And they said, well, that's always been the tradition of the university, and so we just expected it would be that way. Well, there's a literature on marriage that talks about if you want a strong, trusting relationship in a marriage, you've got to share your histories and your traditions so that the other person will know it. And that came to mind when I heard them that day, because we hadn't sat down. We had not talked about what their experience has been before that. And so that's an insight that I want to share with you as you begin partnerships or as you work with partners. It's an important conversation to have. Also sharing experiences, and we did a whole lot of that. Those long nights, we'd be working on curriculum, and then one of the teachers would share an experience, and we'd go, oh, we never thought about that, you know, because we were working at a very different level. And then when you're working with a partner, it's really important to establish your expectations very clearly right from the start, but then know that they're going to have to be monitored consistently. A couple of you this morning who presented talked about how things changed as you went along. And you got to be comfortable with that kind of ambiguity and that kind of flexibility, or it's really hard to work in partnership with community. Community is so much more dynamic than we are. Don't take offense at that, but things happen so fast and so often and so unexpectedly in community. We have some of that in higher ed, but not anything close to what people in community are dealing with, especially right now. It's just so fluid. And so kind of pay attention to that, and that's why that need to monitor expectations is important. I also kept writing, but I liked writing books in which I could talk to students because that was so much the teacher in me. So this was a 4th edition of that book. The teaching strategies went through 5 editions, and then I got tired of revising it. So anyway, here's one chapter in it, and it's called Families and Communities, Context for Understanding Children, because I wanted that belief to be a very important part of my writing. All right, the next big collaboration I engaged in was something called, development of something called a Child and Family Studies major. And the exciting thing about this was collaboration on 2 levels. We started with, by the way, we started at a time when there was no money, so this will be familiar, okay? And we organized a group on the campus that taught anything to do with children and families. So we started with the faculty and staff, and we spent a year just talking, and that doesn't sound like much, but that was actually quite powerful. And came up with the idea for this major, and we figured out ways to fit a lot of these courses together and how it would work. And then we invited community partners, anybody who would be interested in a student with that kind of background. So we had adoption agencies, and we had social service agencies, and we had the public library, children's librarians. We had this wonderful wide range of community partners. Our community partners reviewed all our curriculum materials that we had so far and spent a day with us and really guided the rest of the curriculum development and worked closely with us. They were so happy to be involved. It was just the most exciting day. We learned so much to enhance that program. And what you can see there on my slide is our curriculum was so rich as a result, and our program was so dynamic. It made for very connected practica and internships, really well connected, coming out of community interest and needs. Career preparation was at an all-time high. We got grants after a while, and very meaningful employment for our graduates. That is still one of the strongest programs. That's about 20 years ago. It's one of the strongest programs at Portland State. It's one that has continued to grow and grow and grow and grow because of the breadth of preparation and the kind of variety of careers students can take. All through those first couple of years, our community partners would come in and teach a class and add to the program, and they called it their program as well as our program, and it was just probably one of the best experiences anybody could have. What I mean by that second point when I say start in faculty home, to me faculty home is faculty's courses. That's where they feel most comfortable, that's what they know best, they have ownership kind of issues. And that's where we started before extending out, so everybody had a solid, comfortable spot. Then I made a career change and became Director of Community University Partnerships. Judith decided to really set the university on that course. My work in child and family studies made me very eligible for that job, but I quickly read all the literature on service learning and engagement. It was very early, so there wasn't very much literature, so I could manage it quickly. And I got the job, and I was absolutely thrilled because it sort of pulled together everything I ever cared about. We were an urban setting, it was perfect. There was a long tradition of engagement with community. Community had even co-built some of our buildings on campus, which I didn't even know about at the time. We also have a lot of non-traditional students, and our students stayed in Portland. So that mission, let knowledge serve the city, had to be translated in two ways. We had to do a really super job of educating those students because they were going to stay. And we had to do a super job of extending the resources of the university to the community. And Judith is the one who was very clear to say, the community is our extended classroom. Community partners are co-teachers with us. She insisted that everyone on campus start developing that thinking. Well, that was a perfect alignment with my thinking about teaching. So we developed what we called community-based learning courses because we didn't like the word service. And we spent long conversations about that. And because of where we were, right in the middle of the city, it just was a better phrase to call our courses. But I remember spending a long time. Some of you know about Portland State's capstones. I helped initiate those. Every year, 2,000 seniors in Portland are in the community doing capstones, and our capstones are significant. They have to be. These are people ready to graduate, so we don't want low-level projects or anything. They're all collaborative projects. You don't get to do a capstone by yourself, and you don't get to do a capstone with students in your major. So it's a music student and a math student and a psych student working together. And in years after we started, when we started collecting data, the most powerful thing from the viewpoint of those students is what they learn from working with students in other majors. Okay? That turned out to be the most powerful aspect of learning. The other thing we did right from the very beginning, because I thought, wow, what if people change their minds about this? Having been in higher ed for a while, I'd gone through lots of changes. You know, you get all revved up and everybody's going to do this, and then it wanes and then it goes away. And I just couldn't stand to experience one more of those. So we began to assess our community-based learning courses and our capstones right from the very beginning. We did not know what we were doing. I have to be very honest about that. I also saw that if I was going to convince faculty to do this work, it had to be scholarship, and the university had to support it as scholarship. So that was some of the earliest work on turning this into scholarship. The partnership ideas we developed, and some of this is probably not new to you, but that idea of clear needs and intentions. I I learned a lot the hard way in those first few years, I gotta tell you, because there was nothing to turn to say, make sure you've got this happening, make sure this is going on. So Judith would go out on the weekends, and Judith spent her weekends in the community, going to everything imaginable, with my cards in her pocket. And on Monday morning, my phone would ring off the wall with people who had met her saying, oh, Judith said we should talk to you because you can help us with this need and that need. And so, of course, I would welcome people in and we'd talk. And what I learned the hard way is if the community partners weren't clear on what they needed to have done, we could waste a year or two of everybody's time. Students would not have good experiences. Faculty members would get discouraged and not want to be part of it. And of course, our community partners would be disappointed because they hadn't figured out what they wanted. So that was one of the things I learned to spend a lot more time on, is getting those well-defined. I also learned about reciprocity, which I hadn't really ever thought about till then, that both needs have to be met. And I have to say, check yourself and see if this is true here. I think we went overboard on one side of reciprocity for a while, that is making sure community partner needs were really well met. And I think that's still a tendency, and I think we've got to pay attention to both sides. The university needs to be impacted by these relationships, not just students. Faculty's ideas have to be changed, the institution needs to be changed, and I think at least we didn't pay attention to that side of reciprocity. And I think as I go around the country, I think people say reciprocity, but what they really mean is make sure you're paying attention to what the community wants to get out of it. And you need to really pay attention to both, or it won't be as rich a relationship. I put late awareness for this third one because, see if you can identify with this one. We were so enthused about the work that we just jumped in and did a whole lot of it, and then realized that just like any other form of scholarship, we had to start with the literature. Like faculty in sociology, before they ever start interacting on a community project, should be looking at the sociological literature and pulling ideas from there to work with people. Some of you are shaking your heads, so it tells me you are aware of this. We didn't start out with that awareness. I'm sort of embarrassed to tell you. It was a kind of late awareness where we went, oh, wait, this is not going to be scholarship if you're not starting with the kind of inquiry you do in research, the kind of literature search you do if you're doing traditional scholarship. So partway into this, we decided, oh my gosh, we're not operating like scholars. We've got to go back to being the scholars that we were prepared to be while doing community work. And by the way, the community work gets a whole lot better when you do it that way. The quality of it's so much better. So if you've forgotten that, make sure you're paying attention. And then put a whole lot of energy into making sure the institutional reward systems were going to honor and respect and reward the faculty that were doing this kind of work. And fortunately, Portland State was willing to change their guidelines. They used Ernie Boyer's work to rewrite the whole promotion and tenure system. I naively thought that's all we needed, that everybody'd be okay now, and young new faculty told me, I'm not willing to trust that system till I see that it's really going to happen. And so until faculty were successful doing that, people weren't ready to trust that system. We did early assessment of those community-based learning courses, and it was exciting work, but I got to tell you, it was all indirect and descriptive, lots of anecdotal evidence, which for a while was okay, but it's not very compelling after a while when you're looking for money and resources to support you. We made sure we studied all constituencies, so we studied students, we studied faculty, we studied the community partners, and we studied our institution and learned a lot, learned a whole lot. Closing the loop, do you know what I mean by that? Closing the loop is when you use your data to make changes or to keep improving things, rather than just collecting data and it sits somewhere. And so we made changes early on in our community-based learning courses based on the data we collected the first few years. For example, here's a tiny one. Students said, if I knew when I registered for a course it was a community-based course, then I'd be prepared for it in my schedule. So we quickly got the registrar to put a little symbol in our catalog. Now that's not a very big thing, but that made a huge difference to students, and it was one of the things we heard from real early on. Faculty revealed that they didn't know how to do reflection very well. They hadn't been prepared to do that. And so we quickly did lots of workshops on reflection. That's called closing the loop, using what you learn in assessment to make changes or improve things. Our later efforts included student learning outcomes. Do all of you use student learning outcomes for your engagement work with students? Anybody? Your accreditation agency probably insists you do, and I think that's fine, by the way. That's one of the things I really support. All right. Then my own leadership in all of this took the form of workshops for something that's gone now, American Association of Higher Education. We did all the beginning workshops on scholarship of engagement, and later, and now AACU. I had the very good fortune to meet Ernest Linton. And if you don't know him, he was a really good friend of Ernest Boyer, and he took Ernie Boyer's work and then continued it into the Scholarship of Engagement. And with Ernest Linton, we got lots of Kellogg money. Kellogg was very, very committed to this work. And the first thing we did was pull people from all over the country, faculty who were doing this work, and had them write up their work as scholarship. And it was a painful process, I gotta tell you. We worked a long time because nobody was used to writing up this kind of work as scholarship. We've all been prepared to do very traditional scholarship. And we worked for 2 solid weeks together with individual work in between, figuring out how to write about the scholarship of engagement. Developed those into national cases. It became a book so that people could use it as a model for different, and we had all different disciplines represented. From there, we developed criteria and standards for scholarship of engagement. Those are still around. You can find those on a website. And we developed the National Review Board for the Scholarship of Engagement, because what faculty told us is, I don't have anybody on my campus who will understand my work and review it in the way it needed to be reviewed. Now that was ways back. The board is gone because now people have colleagues on their campuses that can review their work. But at that time, a lot of people were operating in very isolated ways doing this work, and then came time for review, and they'd be turning it over to colleagues who really didn't understand it. So the review board was a movement for that. This is the book that Ernest and I wrote, and it's pretty amazing. We would write in his home. He was quite ill with cancer at that time. And then he'd rest in the afternoons, and then in the evening we'd review what we wrote. And we were just working against the timeline of his cancer to get this finished. I've had some pretty amazing opportunities, I have to say. This is another book Giovanna mentioned, where I first did some stuff on my memoirs of what changes had occurred in engagement. Then I decided to retire, sort of. I still do this all the time. So retirement for me means I don't go to meetings. I can work in my pajamas till 10 or 11 in the morning if I want to, and write. Some of you will identify with that. And as I was making the decision and doing all the paperwork and all that stuff, I started thinking, okay, what can I do? What can I do? Because that's just who I am. And those of you know Tom Ehrlich. Tom Ehrlich is a really good friend of mine. And he said to me, don't plan anything. Don't fill up that calendar. Just leave it empty, be open, sit back, be blank, which was really hard. But I thought, okay, I'm going to pay attention. He's very wise. So I was doing consulting around, and that was fine. I continued that. But one day I got the call from the Carnegie Foundation, and thank goodness I hadn't filled up my calendar, because I would have had to say no to Carnegie, which would have been horrible. Anyway, Carnegie called and said, we think we're going to do a classification on community engagement, and my head just exploded. It was the most exciting thing I could think of. And so I coordinated the development of that, and I coordinated the actual classification 3 different times. We're getting ready, by the way, for 2015. We did 2 years apart in the beginning because we wanted to make sure everything was working well, and now we're going to do every 5 years, much like the other classification. And I spent my mornings making sandwiches at Loaves and Fishes. I finally got to do the work that I had wanted students to do all that time. I'd never had time to do any of it myself, I'm confessing here. And I also went on a habitat trip with my grandson in New Orleans. So let me tell you quickly about designing the Carnegie classification. They wanted me to just sit down and design it, and I said, no. I've only worked on a couple campuses. You know, you need a bigger perspective. So Carnegie at that time could do this. They enhanced the budget, and I started by just interviewing national leaders all over the country who were doing engagement, and my literature review. You see, I had to stay committed to that. Then we invited 2 representatives from each of 12 institutions, really different kind of places, okay? Because I didn't want this just to be the experience of a large public research university, and I didn't want it to be the experience of a small faith-based campus or a private liberal arts college. And we got everything possible represented in there. And together we worked, again, long, grueling hours with everybody having different ideas about it until we could pull it together into a pilot. And then those 12 campuses piloted it before we put it out for public, because there was lots to work through and to change. I do want you to know the intentions, and I know that your campus has the Carnegie classification, and hopefully it did this. We wanted to honor and really acknowledge all the incredible work people were already doing, because if you looked around, and this was like, what, almost 10 years ago, people were doing amazing work in community engagement. And with Lee Schulman's leadership, that was going to be a very important thing for the classification to do. We also wanted to honor how very differently people were doing it. One of the things you'll see in the classification, well, you already know, is there's not a right way to do any of the things. There's just things that have to be in place, but then you can do them in ways that are right for your students, your community, your institution. We also wanted to guide institutions to good practices, and what's really exciting is that we've heard over and over again from successful campuses that they've really improved what they were doing in order to qualify. But we've also heard from campuses that made decisions not to apply. And what they say is, we needed to improve a lot of what we were doing before we could apply. So that's kind of nice affirmation. And then lastly, we hoped that the classification process would produce really useful data. And what I hear now a lot, in fact, someone just told me, is that campuses are using their Carnegie data for accreditation. And that was our intention, is that you wouldn't collect a whole batch of data and not use it for anything else, sit on a shelf in a book or something, that you could use it for lots of things. Campuses are using it to apply for grants. Campuses are using it to meet accreditation standards. In 2010, when we looked at the applications, I would say that more than half of them mentioned using it for accreditation, and we were just cheering about that, because life is short and you have too much other work to do, so we wanted it to be useful. I also had a really exciting opportunity that I have to share with you. There was a US delegation to Russia developed when newly elected President Obama went to meet with the Russian President Medvedev, I learned to say. And there was 4 of us representing higher education, and the reason I was selected was community engagement, which I was really excited to take over to the thinking. And we had interest groups with US educators and Russian educators. There were interest groups with health folks from US and Russia, media folks from US and Russia. Lots of controversial stuff. We learned a whole lot about the culture there and the politics, et cetera. There's a picture of one of the places I got to see, and here's our president, and I was just a few feet away and got to shake his hand, so that was a pretty exciting time for me. All right, so then I decided to go back to Portland because of a lot of things about the city that are there. The public transportation, it's a city of volunteers, and it's a city of neighborhoods, and a dynamic downtown where everything's alive all the time. I built a family compound, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. I'm real active in small-scale agriculture. I support a female rancher and a female farmer and a female pig raiser and a female chicken raiser, you know, to compete with the big farms and stuff. And I also care about the quality of what I eat and my family eats. And we all work at the food bank and are involved in a lot of other local projects. That's it.